The morning light slashed through the blinds of Garrett Harris's small office, casting long shadows across the worn desk cluttered with old blueprints, mining equipment catalogs and scattered notes. It was 6 a.m. and he had just finished his usual breakfast, a half-eaten bagel and a steaming mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm. The hum of the coffee maker, a sound he found oddly comforting, filled the silence. He was preparing to review the project proposals for the next big excavation when the phone rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the calm of the early hours. Garrett's eyes flicked to the phone. He didn't expect many calls this early, let alone from anyone who had his personal number. He hesitated for a moment before reaching over, grabbing the receiver and answering with a gruff tone. Garrett Harris speaking. "Garrett, it's Bob Griffin," came the familiar voice of his longtime colleague from Pinnacle Mining. Bob's voice was tinged with an unusual edge of urgency, something Garrett hadn't heard in years. "Bob? What's going on?" Garrett asked, sitting up straighter, his mind already shifting gears. I don't know how to explain this, but we've got a situation. A strange one," Bob continued, his words hanging in the air. There was a brief pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Garrett could tell something was off. Bob was never one to hesitate. "A situation? What kind of situation?" Garrett's pulse quickened slightly. Bob had called him out on projects before, complicated structural integrity issues, collapsing mine tunnels, dangerous equipment failures, but the tone of his voice hinted at something far more alarming. "It's not your standard structural concern," Bob replied, his voice dropping to a whisper as if someone might overhear. We've found something deep in one of the tunnels. Something unnatural." The word sent a chill down Garrett's spine. Bob didn't throw around words like unnatural lightly. "What do you mean by unnatural?" Garrett pressed, his mind already racing through possible explanations. Cavernous formations, old structural remains, maybe even ancient mineral deposits. "There's a door," Bob said, almost as though the words themselves were difficult to say aloud. "A stone door. And it's not like anything we've ever seen." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "A stone door?" His mind immediately jumped to ancient ruins, secret chambers, things that didn't belong in the midst of a modern mining operation. "A door? In a mine?" Garrett's voice was skeptical. "You've got to be kidding me." "It's real, Garrett. It's made of stone, and the symbols, they're not anything we've found in any of the old mining records. It's cold. Unnaturally cold, like nothing we've ever measured before." Garrett leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip from his mug. "Cold?" he asked, his mind grappling with the implications. "How cold?" 17 degrees colder than the surrounding air. And it's not like there's a source for it. No breeze, no underground spring, nothing. Just this intense, unexplainable chill. A silence fell between them, the weight of Bob's words pressing on Garrett's chest. He had worked with Bob for over 10 years, and while the man had never been one to exaggerate, there was an undeniable tension in his voice. "Are you telling me that your team is refusing to work near it?" Garrett asked, his brow furrowing as he processed the information. Bob sighed heavily. "Yeah. A few of the guys tried to go down there yesterday, but they backed off as soon as they saw the door. They said they could hear things. Whispers. Some of them quit on the spot. The rest won't even go near the tunnel anymore." Garrett's stomach churned at the mention of whispers. That was no longer a simple mining problem. Something about it felt wrong, disturbingly wrong. "So what do you want me to do?" Garrett asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the unease gnawed at him. "I need you to come out here," Bob said, his voice firm now. "We need someone who can handle the technical side of things, but also someone who isn't going to be rattled by things that don't have an explanation. We've got a photographer, a young guy named Lyle Miller, who's scheduled to come out tomorrow. But I need you here today, Garrett. We need to document this properly one way or another." Garrett stared out the window of his office, watching the sun rise over the mountains in the distance. Mysterious stone doors, whispers in the tunnels, a freezing cold that defied logic. It all sounded more like a legend than something found in a modern mining operation. But Bob wasn't the kind of guy to make this up. "I'll be there," Garrett said finally, his voice filled with determination despite the creeping unease in his gut. "I'll grab my gear and head over right away. I'll meet you at your office around 9. "Perfect," Bob replied, relief evident in his voice. "I'll see you then." And Garrett, be prepared for something strange. "I don't know what's going on, but I feel like we're standing on the edge of something we can't control." "Understood," Garrett said, a shiver running down his spine despite himself. As the call ended, Garrett sat in the quiet of his office, the phone still warm in his hand. He had been in the mining industry for over 20 years, working on projects all over the country, California, Colorado, Nevada, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. A stone door, unexplained cold, whispers in the tunnels, it all sounded like something out of a nightmare. But Bob had always trusted his judgment, and now, it was up to Garrett to find out what lay beyond that door. Whatever it was, it seemed to have made its presence known, and it wasn't about to stay hidden for much longer. Garrett grabbed his worn leather jacket from the back of his chair and pulled it on. He would need his boots, his tools, and his wits. He just hoped they would be enough. The drive to the Pinnacle Mining headquarters took nearly an hour, winding through the steep, craggy roads of the Peruvian mountains. The air was thin and crisp, the altitude making every breath a little more laborious. As Garrett neared the mining complex, he could see the looming peaks of the Andes in the distance, the sun casting long shadows over the valley below. When he arrived at the complex, Bob was waiting for him outside, his face ashen, his posture stiff. "Garrett," Bob greeted him with a strange smile. "Thanks for coming so quickly. Let's get inside." The two men walked into the building together, and Bob led Garrett to his office without exchanging any of their usual banter. As the door clicked shut behind them, Bob didn't waste any time. He grabbed a folder from his desk and handed it to Garrett. "This is what we've got so far," Bob said. "The photographs and measurements. Everything." Garrett flipped open the folder, scanning the contents quickly. The first page held a rough sketch of the stone door, its surface covered in intricate, swirling symbols. The next pages contained temperature readings, all pointing to a dramatic drop in temperature around the door. No explanation, just the cold. He closed the folder, the weight of it settling heavily in his hands. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. "We're dealing with something strange," Garrett said quietly, meeting Bob's eyes. "Yeah. And I'm not sure how much longer we can keep it quiet." The two men exchanged a look, and in that moment both knew. Whatever lay in the depths of the mine had already begun to affect more than just the miners. It was only a matter of time before it came to the surface, and when it did, it would change everything. The flight from the US to Peru had been long and exhausting, a blur of cramped airplane seats and jet lag. Garrett Harris had spent the entire 10-hour flight in a haze of restless thoughts, occasionally flicking through the folder Bob Griffin had handed him. He couldn't stop thinking about the stone door, the door that had been found deep beneath the ground in a mine near Machu Picchu. The thought of a door that shouldn't exist, sealed behind ancient symbols and strange cold, gnawed at him like a bad taste in his mouth. Beside him on the flight was Lyle Miller, the young photographer from Aurora Documentation Services, who had been tasked with recording the mysterious findings in the mine. Lyle wasn't exactly what Garrett would have imagined for the job. A recent graduate from a photography program in Chicago, Lyle was more accustomed to snapping pictures of cityscapes and modern architecture, not cold, dark tunnels filled with unknown dangers. But his nerves were buried beneath a layer of professionalism, even if Garrett could see the unease in the way Lyle kept glancing out of the window at the Andean peaks below. When they finally arrived in Cusco, the air was thin, and the altitude made each breath feel like an effort. Garrett felt the familiar tightness in his chest as the plane touched down on the cracked runway, surrounded by towering mountains. This was a place where history lingered in the air like the dust of ancient civilizations. But it wasn't just history that had drawn him here, it was the unknown, something that had defied every explanation he'd ever learned in his years of work in the mining industry. The sun was setting over the mountains, casting long shadows across the town of Cusco, which sat nestled at the edge of the sacred valley. Lyle shuffled beside Garrett as they exited the airport, the two of them carrying their gear through the hustle and bustle of the small city. The traffic was chaotic, and the streets were filled with a blend of locals, tourists, and street vendors, all moving with a hurried sense of purpose. Yet despite the energy around him, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them on the other side of the mountain range, something ancient, something wrong. Their ride to the mining complex was arranged by Bob's team, a small van that bumped along the narrow roads that wound through the mountains. The sky had turned a deep shade of indigo, stars beginning to peek out above the jagged peaks, when they finally began the long ascent to the mine site. The van rattled and groaned as it climbed higher, the roads becoming narrower and steeper, barely wide enough for the van to pass. Garrett stared out the window, his thoughts lingering on the door, the strange stone construction, and the cold that had radiated from it. How could a door like that even exist, hidden deep within the earth? And why had the miners been so unnerved by it that they had abandoned their posts, refusing to return? Lyle seemed to sense the weight of the situation, but he kept asking questions, eager to fill the silence. "Do you think it's some kind of ancient artifact?" he asked, adjusting his camera bag in his lap. Maybe, Garrett replied. But it's too unusual. It's one thing to find remnants of an ancient civilization, a tomb, a structure, anything that makes sense to the human mind. But this, he shook his head, trailing off. This doesn't feel like something we're meant to understand. Lyle nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Yeah, but ancient civilizations had some wild stuff, right? Maybe it's a relic we just don't have the context for yet. I don't know, Garrett muttered. It doesn't feel like that. It feels wrong. The van crept up a winding path as they neared the mining site, the air growing colder with every passing minute. As they finally turned the corner and entered the mining complex, Garrett's heart began to beat a little faster. The site was a sprawling industrial complex set against the backdrop of the mountain. Giant excavation equipment sat idle in the distance, surrounded by rows of small utilitarian buildings. The harsh, artificial lights cast long shadows over everything, making it look like a place that had been forgotten by time. They were greeted by Bob Griffin as soon as they arrived, his face a mask of exhaustion. His clothes were dusty, his hair unkempt. He looked like someone who hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of rest. Garrett, Lyle, Bob said, his voice heavy with concern. Thanks for getting here. We've got a few more things to set up, but you'll want to get down to the tunnel as soon as possible. Lead the way, Garrett replied, his voice steady despite the dread settling in his stomach. Bob led them through the maze of corridors and into the heart of the operation. The cold was palpable as they descended deeper into the mine. The air smelled of damp rock and oil, the faint echo of heavy equipment ringing in the distance. It felt like they were getting further away from the world of the living, sinking into the belly of the mountain. Do you feel that? Lyle asked, his voice barely audible over the echoing sounds of their footsteps. It's colder than I expected. Garrett nodded. The temperature had dropped noticeably as they descended further. The mine's cooling systems were designed to keep things at a stable temperature, but this was different. It was as if the very earth itself was radiating an unnatural chill, one that seeped into your bones and left you shivering. Bob led them to a large elevator shaft at the end of the tunnel, the walls of the shaft slick with moisture. They rode the elevator down, and as they descended, the temperature continued to plummet. When the doors opened at the bottom, Garrett was hit by the cold like a wall, a sharp, biting sensation that made his breath fog in the air. This is it, Bob said, standing in front of a section of the tunnel that seemed to stretch on endlessly into the darkness. E15. The door is just ahead. Garrett felt a shiver run down his spine as they moved forward. The tunnel walls grew narrow, the air thinner, colder. As they walked deeper, the shadows stretched unnaturally around them, twisting like living things. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, a reminder of how far from the surface they were. Are you ready? Bob asked, glancing over at Garrett as they approached the end of the tunnel. Garrett nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He'd been prepared for this moment, but now that he was standing here, it felt like they were crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. As they reached the end of the tunnel, Garrett's light fell on the stone door. It was even larger than he'd imagined, nearly 8 feet tall and set into the rock like something that belonged to another era, another world. The surface was smooth, too smooth for natural stone, covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. Bob stepped forward and extended his hand toward the door, but Garrett grabbed his arm, stopping him. Not yet, Garrett said, his voice low. Let's document everything first. We don't know what might happen if we touch it. Bob nodded, stepping back. Lyle was already taking photos, his camera clicking away as he captured the door from every angle. Garrett set his bag down and began pulling out his tools, setting up sensors and temperature gauges to take readings. The cold radiating from the door was more intense up close, and as Garrett ran his fingers along the edge of the stone, he felt a strange vibration beneath his skin, as though the door was alive, somehow aware of their presence. There's something wrong with this, Garrett muttered to himself, stepping back and studying the door again. Lyle looked at him, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Garrett didn't answer. He just stared at the door, feeling the weight of something ancient and dangerous pressing down on him. We need to open it, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyle blinked. What? We need to open it, Garrett repeated, his voice more resolute now. This is it. The door. Whatever's beyond it, we need to know. We need to document it. For Theo. Bob looked at him, his face pale. Are you sure? But Garrett was already stepping forward, his hand outstretched toward the symbols. This time there would be no turning back. Garrett's fingers hovered over the ancient symbols etched deep into the stone. A faint hum, barely perceptible, vibrated under his touch. It wasn't the cold that made his skin prickle, it was the sensation of something unseen, something beyond the door, reaching for them, beckoning them into its depths. Beside him, Lyle clicked his camera, his nervous energy palpable as he stepped back to get a broader shot of the stone structure. "You sure about this?" Lyle's voice was laced with unease, but his fingers never stopped working the camera's shutter. Garrett glanced at him, his heart pounding in his chest. "We have to. For Theo, for all of this. We need to know what's behind it." His voice was firm, yet the uncertainty gnawed at him. Bob, who had been silent, standing a few paces behind them, finally spoke. "Just be careful. This could go south fast." Garrett nodded, but his mind was already on the door, on the unknown that waited beyond it. His hand finally made contact with the spiral in the center of the stone. The moment his fingers pressed into the symbols, the hum intensified. The stone felt alive under his skin, warm, almost like it was breathing. Then, without warning, a low, rumbling sound filled the chamber, as if the earth itself was waking up from a deep, centuries-old slumber. The door began to shift. It was slow at first, a barely perceptible movement as the stone slab groaned against its ancient hinges. Then, with a sudden rush of cold air, the door jerked open, the sound echoing through the tunnel like a thunderclap. Garrett took a step back instinctively as the temperature plummeted in an instant. The air felt thin and cold, like the breath of something ancient and forgotten. His light flickered momentarily, struggling against the unnatural chill emanating from beyond the threshold. Lyle, wide-eyed, stepped forward cautiously. "Jesus," he muttered, this doesn't look like a mine." Garrett felt his breath catch in his throat as he looked into the cavern beyond the door. His light cut through the darkness, but the sight before him was beyond anything he could have imagined. The space beyond the door stretched out like an impossible world, one that shouldn't exist in the heart of a mountain. Gigantic, towering structures filled the cavern, their surfaces glistening with an eerie, unnatural light. It was as if the architecture itself had been forged from something not of this world, smooth, crystalline, but undeniably solid. Some structures seemed to float in midair, defying the laws of physics. Others twisted and spiraled, their forms geometrically impossible. It felt like a city, but not one built by human hands. The patterns, the design, it was all wrong. Nothing made sense. But there was no denying it, there was something here. Something ancient, something powerful, something that had been waiting to be uncovered. Lyle stepped forward, his camera raised, his hands trembling slightly. This is incredible," he breathed, capturing shot after shot. But Garrett didn't share his awe. His instincts, honed over years of underground exploration, screamed at him that this was far beyond the realm of safe discovery. There was no telling what was in there, or what might come out. "We need to be careful," Garrett murmured. "We don't know what this is." Before Lyle could respond, a distant rumble filled the air. It wasn't like anything Garrett had ever heard. It was deeper than any sound he had encountered before, reverberating through the ground beneath them, shaking the walls of the tunnel. "What the hell was that?" Lyle asked, his voice higher now, a tremor of fear creeping into his words. Garrett's heart raced. He turned to Bob, who had been standing silently, watching the door open with wide, fearful eyes. "We need to get out of here. This isn't right. The door shouldn't have opened this easily." But before he could say anything else, there was a loud crack above them. Garrett's head snapped up, his light swinging wildly as he tried to locate the source of the sound. The ceiling above them shifted, stone grinding against stone. The rumbling grew louder, almost deafening, as pieces of the rock above them began to break loose. "Lyle?" Garrett shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "Get back." But Lyle didn't move fast enough. With a horrible sound of tearing stone, the ceiling gave way and a massive chunk of rock, the size of a car, plummeted down toward them. Garrett shoved Lyle aside just as the rock smashed into the ground, missing them by inches. But not everyone was so lucky. Lyle screamed, his body knocked to the floor, a second stone block landing on top of him with a sickening thud. The sound of crunching bones filled the air. Garrett's breath froze in his chest as he scrambled toward Lyle, but it was too late. Lyle's body was pinned under the heavy rock, blood pooling around him, his eyes wide and unblinking. Garrett's hands shook as he tried to move the stone, but it was too heavy, too massive to move by hand. "Lyle?" Garrett shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "No. No, no, no." But there was no answer. The cold air seemed to intensify as the weight of the situation hit Garrett. He had no time to mourn. No time to process the horror of what had just happened. The door had been opened, and now, it was clear that whatever had been sealed behind it was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Bob rushed forward, his face pale with shock. "Get out of there, Garrett. We need to go." But Garrett couldn't move. He stared at Lyle, his friend and colleague, now lifeless and buried under the rubble. And then his eyes shifted back to the cavern, the enormous space beyond the door. The structures within it, the strange, pulsating light, and the low, almost imperceptible hum that filled the air. Something was watching them. Something had awoken. And it was only a matter of time before it came for them. "Garrett." Bob's voice was urgent now, fear evident in every syllable. Garrett forced himself to stand, stumbling back as he glanced at the now darkened doorway. The coldness seemed to deepen around him, and he swore he could feel a shift in the air. Something was closing in. "We need to go now," Garrett yelled, his voice filled with urgency as he turned and ran, leaving Lyle behind. He couldn't process it. Not yet. His mind was reeling with shock and adrenaline, pulling him forward through the narrow tunnels toward safety, toward the surface. But deep inside he knew the truth. They had opened a door to something they could never fully understand. And now there was no turning back. The whispers, the strange cold, the unearthly world behind the door, they were only the beginning. Something had been awakened, and it wasn't done with them yet. The pain of Lyle's death gnawed at Garrett's insides like a persistent, festering wound. Every step he took, every breath he drew felt hollow. It was as if the world had lost its color, its meaning, leaving only the sharp, biting cold of regret in its place. Every time he closed his eyes, the images of Lyle, pinned under the stone, his lifeless eyes staring blankly into nothing, flashed before him. Garrett hadn't had time to properly grieve. There was no room for mourning. There was only the door, the cavern, and the ever-present threat of what might be waiting for them on the other side. But now, sitting at a nondescript cafe in the heart of Lima, Garrett felt the weight of his decision settle deeper into his chest. The ghosts of what he had seen under Machu Picchu, of the cavern, the otherworldly structures, and the whispers that refused to leave his mind, had only multiplied. Whatever he had opened in that mind was not done with him yet. And Lyle's death was only the first consequence. "Mr. Harris," a voice broke through his foggy thoughts. Garrett blinked, his thoughts snapping back to the present. A man in his late 50s stood before him, his skin weathered from years of fieldwork. Dr. Elias Gomez, a renowned archaeologist specializing in Incan culture, extended a hand. His eyes, sharp and calculating, bore into Garrett as if he could read everything in his soul. Garrett stood, shaking the professor's hand, his grip firm but distracted. "Dr. Gomez," he said, sitting back down. "Thank you for meeting me." Dr. Gomez took a seat across from him, his features tense with the gravity of their situation. "I understand the circumstances," he said slowly. "You were with Mr. Stewart when he died?" His voice caught at the end of the sentence, though he quickly masked his emotions. Garrett nodded, unable to find the words to express the weight of the loss. "Yes," he managed. "He didn't make it out. And something is happening." He hesitated. "Something is trying to get out." Gomez's eyes flickered, a mix of concern and something deeper, something that Garrett couldn't place. It was as if he already knew what Garrett was about to say, as if he had seen this all before. "It's been happening for centuries," the archaeologist muttered, more to himself than to Garrett. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Garrett froze, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Gomez leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've been researching Incan records for the better part of my life. Ancient texts, long buried in the ruins of temples, speak of doors, portals to other realms, gateways to places far beyond our understanding. What you uncovered under Machu Picchu, that's what these texts describe." Garrett stared at him. "Portals?" he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "To other worlds? You mean like dimensions?" Gomez nodded gravely. "Yes, but the Inca believed these were not just passages. They were entrances to places that should never be opened, worlds that were forbidden. And yet, the records suggest that the Incas themselves opened them, for reasons lost to time." The air in the cafe grew thick with an unsettling silence. Garrett's pulse quickened. The memory of the door under the mountain, the eerie cold that had followed them, the whispers that had driven Lyle mad, pressed into him like a suffocating weight. "But why the secrecy?" Garrett asked, leaning forward. "If this has been going on for centuries, why hasn't anyone done anything? Why isn't there more about this, about the doors, out there?" Dr. Gomez sighed, his face shadowed by years of hard work and contemplation. "There's always been a cover-up, Mr. Harris. You see, the Incas themselves feared what they had uncovered. They wrote about it in secret texts, hidden away for centuries. And when the Spanish came, they destroyed most of those texts, burned the archives, and attempted to erase all knowledge of the portals from history. What remained, what was hidden deep within the mountains and jungles of Peru, remained largely unknown. Until now." Garrett swallowed hard. The weight of what they had discovered was beginning to settle into the pit of his stomach. "But the door we opened, is it one of these portals?" "I believe so," Gomez replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The cold, the strange markings, the patterns, they all match what the texts describe. But there is something else, something you might not have considered." Garrett frowned. "What do you mean?" The archaeologist glanced around the cafe, as though ensuring no one could overhear them, then leaned closer. "The records speak of an entity, an ancient presence that resides beyond the doors. Some believe it is not just a physical place but a kind of consciousness, a collective entity that has existed since the dawn of time. The Incas feared it just as modern researchers do now. And they believed that once the doors were opened, it would awaken." A chill crept over Garrett, making him shiver despite the warm, bustling cafe. The memories of the door, of the terrible energy that radiated from it, of the crushing cold, rushed back. He could hear the whispers again, distant and indistinct. Could it be that what he had uncovered was something older than the Incas? Something not just ancient but alive? "You're saying we're dealing with something alive?" Garrett's voice was hoarse. "Something that's been waiting for us to open these doors?" Dr. Gomez nodded solemnly. "Yes. The texts warned of it. They described how those who opened the doors became vessels, conduits for whatever was on the other side. Those who survived the encounter were never the same. They spoke of nightmares, of voices calling to them, of the cold that never left them, no matter how far they traveled." Garrett's stomach churned. Lyle's death, the cold that followed him back to his apartment, the whispers that haunted him, was this the same thing? Had Lyle been affected by whatever lay behind the door? And worse, had it followed them both into the world? Dr. Gomez's eyes darkened. "That's why we need to proceed carefully. These doors, they are not meant to be opened. They are not just passages, they are warnings. And I believe we are now on the brink of something much, much worse." Garrett was silent for a long moment, absorbing the enormity of what Gomez had said. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, heavier than any boulder, colder than any mountain. Lyle's death had been the first casualty, but it wouldn't be the last. Not if they kept going. "Tell me what you need me to do," Garrett said, his voice steady, though his insides were churning with dread. Dr. Gomez leaned back, his eyes sharp and calculating once again. "We need to gather more information. The Incan texts mention specific rituals, specific methods to either seal or contain the portals once they were opened. I believe the answers are in those records. I can't do this alone. You've seen it, Garrett. You're the one who's already been inside. We need you to help us investigate." Garrett looked at the archaeologist, his eyes narrowing. "You're asking me to go back in?" Dr. Gomez nodded slowly. "Yes. We need to understand more before it's too late. There are other doors. I have reason to believe that what happened to you in Machu Picchu isn't an isolated incident. We've discovered anomalies all over Peru. If the entity has already begun to wake, we may not have much time." Garrett felt his throat tighten. He thought of the images of Lyle, dead in the mine, and the words he had whispered in his final moments. It knows we're here now. It's waking up. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But with that knowledge there was no turning back. "Okay," Garrett said quietly, his voice unwavering. "Let's do this. But I need answers. I need to know everything you've found so far." Gomez smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "I'll make sure you have everything. But be warned, Mr. Harris. What you're about to face will challenge everything you know about reality." As they stood to leave, Garrett felt the heavy weight of that warning settle on him. He had already crossed a line. But now he was stepping into a darkness that might not let him back out. There were more doors. And the whispers were just the beginning. The sun was a dying ember, casting long shadows that stretched across the jagged peaks surrounding Machu Picchu. The famed Incan citadel lay quiet, shrouded in mist, as though nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Garrett stood at the base of the ancient ruins, his mind a whirlwind of fear and dread. Dr. Elias Gomez had led him here, to this place, promising that the answers they sought lay beneath the centuries-old stones. They had already uncovered one door hidden beneath the mountain. It had opened with the touch of a hand, releasing an unspeakable terror and a cold that was beyond the natural world. Lyle was dead. The door was still open, still calling to them. Now, Garrett found himself staring at the entrance to another chamber, one that had been concealed even deeper within the mountain. A part of him knew deep down that they had already gone too far. Whatever secrets lay buried here, they were not meant to be found. Gomez's voice broke through Garrett's spiraling thoughts. "It's here, Harris. The second chamber. I know you're reluctant, but we must proceed." Garrett glanced at the archaeologist, noting the tightness in his jaw. Gomez too felt the weight of what they were about to do. He had been leading excavations in these tunnels for years, but even he could feel the unseen force stirring, urging them toward a fate they didn't understand. The tunnel stretched ahead, deeper into the earth than anything Garrett had encountered in his career. Every footstep echoed, reverberating through the vast, hollow space, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step. The walls, once smooth and carved with ancient Incan symbols, now appeared scarred, as though something had tried to claw its way out from beneath. The air was thick, the scent of damp stone heavy in the cavernous space. As they descended, the sounds of the outside world faded completely, replaced by the whisper of the earth itself, a sound that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Garrett's breath grew shallow, his heartbeat quickening as they drew closer to the chamber. He could feel it now, the cold. It had begun to settle into his bones, but it wasn't the usual chill of a mountain night. No, this was different. It was unnatural. The darkness around them grew impenetrable as they reached the threshold. Dr. Gomez paused, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He turned to Garrett, his face pale, his lips thin with a mixture of resolve and fear. "We're close," Gomez said, his voice tight. "I've seen this before, in the records, the second door, the second entrance. But this one feels wrong, Harris. We may not come back from this." "I've already lost Lyle," Garrett replied, his voice hoarse. "I can't stop now. We need to know what this is. We need to understand what we've found." Gomez nodded solemnly, then pushed forward. The entrance to the chamber was narrow, the walls jagged with the scars of old tools and tools not of this world. The further they went, the stronger the oppressive presence in the air grew, and the deeper the cold dug into Garrett's skin. And then they found it. It stood before them, just as the first had. A stone door, massive and foreboding, nearly 8 feet tall and covered in the same intricate symbols. These symbols, however, were different. While the first door had been inscribed with curving spirals and geometric patterns, this one was entirely composed of interlocking triangles, sharp and jagged, almost violent in their design. Felt aggressive, as if it were daring them to touch it. Garrett's fingers twitched, longing to trace the carvings, but something in the pit of his stomach warned him not to. This was not the same as before. This door was different. "We shouldn't open this," Garrett murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Gomez didn't reply. Instead, he stepped closer to the door, his eyes tracing the symbols with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "The Inca text spoke of 2 doors," he said slowly, his voice tinged with an ancient fear. "One was a gate to knowledge, the other to something darker." Garrett felt his throat constrict. "What do you mean, darker?" Gomez's expression hardened. "There are references to a place beyond these doors, a realm that was never meant to be accessed. Something is trapped there. The texts are clear, but they do not explain what it is. All they say is this: once the doors open, there is no closing them again." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Garrett felt his pulse race. He had already crossed the threshold once, but this felt different. "Should we turn back?" Garrett asked, his voice strained. Gomez took a deep breath. "We're already too far in, Harris. This is the final piece. We have to know. If we don't, then we will never truly understand what we're dealing with." Reluctantly, Garrett stepped forward. His hand reached for the door, but before he could touch it, a violent gust of cold air slammed into him, freezing him to the core. His breath fogged in front of him, and for a moment, everything felt blurry, as if the world itself had distorted. And then it happened. The door moved. It didn't swing open like a normal door. No. The stone slab cracked down the middle, a faint, grinding sound echoing in the cavern, and it began to slide inward as though alive. The cold, the unnatural cold, poured out from the gap, swirling like a storm. The temperature plummeted, and Garrett stumbled back, his legs buckling from the sudden onslaught. He turned to Gomez, who was staring at the opening door, eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," Gomez gasped, his voice trembling. "But it's opening." And with that, the door opened fully. Beyond it, the chamber stretched impossibly wide. It was vast, bigger than the space they were in, bigger than anything that should have been possible under Machu Picchu. The structures beyond were impossible, distorted things, with angles that didn't make sense, walls that folded in on themselves like twisted metal. Some structures seemed to float, suspended in the air, while others were barely visible, fading into the shadows. The cold, it didn't just numb the skin. It reached inside, seeping into the very bones as though it was eroding him from within. Garrett felt an overwhelming urge to step forward, to cross the threshold into this alien world, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as though something was stopping him, keeping him from going further. But then, something in the distance stirred. A shape. No shapes. Moved in the shadows, their forms twitching in and out of existence, shifting like a liquid nightmare. Their movements were erratic, disjointed, as though they were struggling to maintain some semblance of structure. Their features were blurred, impossible to define, but Garrett knew one thing. They were watching him. They knew he was there. The whispers returned, louder this time. They clawed at his mind, gnawing at his sanity. The language they spoke was garbled, twisted, unintelligible. But there was something deeply unnerving about it. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, a consciousness pressing against the walls of his mind, tugging at his very thoughts. Garrett? Gomez's voice broke through the fog in his mind. We need to leave. We need to get out of here. But it was too late. The floor beneath them began to tremble. The very walls seemed to quake in response to something unseen, something ancient and powerful. Garrett's head swam as the ground beneath him shifted. He felt it deep in his chest, a sense of awareness beyond anything human. We have to go, Gomez repeated, his voice urgent, but Garrett couldn't tear his eyes away from the abyss before him. The shapes in the darkness were moving closer, and as they did, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, the presence more tangible. And then, from the depths of the impossible cavern, a sound emerged, a low, guttural growl. Not an animal, not a beast, but something older, something familiar, and it chilled Garrett to his very core. This wasn't a place of forgotten knowledge. This wasn't a relic of an ancient civilization. This was a prison. And whatever was trapped within was now waking up. We've made a mistake, Gomez whispered, his voice hoarse. We shouldn't have come. But it was too late. The door was open, and something on the other side was coming for them. The journey had only just begun, but the weight of it was already suffocating. Garrett stood at the edge of the small, makeshift camp nestled in the shadow of the Andes Mountains. The air was thin here, and the wind carried a bite that felt like it was cutting into his very soul. He glanced at the distant peaks, shrouded in mist, and felt an unsettling chill race down his spine. Something was coming. Something he could not outrun. Since the event beneath Machu Picchu, Garrett had not been the same. He hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time, and even when he did manage to close his eyes, all he saw were those otherworldly shapes, shifting in the darkness, their eyes, if they even had eyes, fixed on him. The whispers never stopped, not even when he was awake. They were inescapable, following him everywhere. He'd made a promise to Theo, to Lyle. He would stop this. Whatever it was that had slipped through those doors, he would shut it down. But as time passed, the crushing realization began to sink in. The doors were not isolated. They were multiplying. And no matter how hard they tried to shut them, new ones were already opening, all over the world. Garrett. The voice came from behind him, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. He turned to find Dr. Ana Rodriguez, a geologist with the expedition, walking toward him. Her expression was tense, but there was a sharp determination in her eyes, something familiar, something he needed right now. Garrett had known Anna for years, but they'd never worked together directly until now. Her expertise with seismic activity and tectonic shifts had made her a crucial part of the team. But more than that, he knew that Anna understood the gravity of what they were up against. We leave in an hour, she said, looking over at the other members of their team as they packed up the last of the gear. Are you ready? Garrett didn't reply immediately. His eyes lingered on the distant mountains. Somewhere in the vast expanse, another door waited to be discovered. He could feel it deep in his bones. The doors were not random, they were being triggered by something. Something they hadn't yet figured out. I'm ready, Garrett finally said, his voice steady but strained. We need to get to that door, Rodriguez. We have to figure out how to stop this before it spreads further. Anna nodded, her lips tight. I know. We're running out of time. The group had been assembled in the wake of the discovery beneath Machu Picchu. A team of researchers, geologists, historians, and a handful of military personnel had been tasked with finding the other doors. But Garrett knew that this wasn't just about scientific discovery anymore. This was about survival. Their destination was an abandoned mining site in southern Peru, near a region known for its ancient ruins, far from the bustling crowds of Machu Picchu. It was a place where local legends spoke of an ancient race that had vanished centuries ago, leaving behind nothing but ruins and forgotten stories. And buried beneath the earth, according to rumors, was another door. Garrett had never been a believer in myths, but everything he had seen, the cold, the whispers, the shifting shapes, had pushed him to the breaking point. His world had collapsed and nothing made sense anymore. What was behind these doors? What were they opening? And why now? The expedition began with the typical hustle of gear, coordinates, and logistical checks. The night before, they had arrived at the nearest town, a small, remote village with little to offer but dusty roads and weary-eyed locals. It was hard to shake the sense that something was watching them, even here. The villagers didn't say much, just offered fearful glances whenever the team made inquiries about the area. They hadn't spoken openly about the doors, but Garrett noticed the way the locals avoided eye contact when they asked about the land. He could feel it, something ancient, something primal about this place that made it feel wrong. The team piled into an old, weather-beaten transport truck, winding their way through narrow mountain roads toward their destination. The ride was slow, the road barely wide enough to fit the vehicle. The thick mist clung to the rocks, swirling like an ethereal fog that obscured the world around them. They passed through dense forests and jagged cliffs, the eerie silence of the mountains pressing down on them. "Do you think they know what's really happening?" Anna asked, her voice soft as she sat beside Garrett. Garrett glanced over at her. "The locals? No. But they know enough to be afraid." Anna's eyes narrowed. "You think it's because of the door?" "Maybe. They're scared of something, I know that much." She looked out the window, her brow furrowing. "I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just about discovering something ancient. We're dealing with something that's alive. Something that's been waiting for a long time." The words echoed in Garrett's mind as they approached the mining site. The air grew heavier, colder, even as the truck rolled through the mountain pass. The road became more treacherous, the path winding through steep hills until they reached a small plateau where the mining equipment lay abandoned, rusting under the relentless passage of time. The site was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind and the occasional creak of old machinery. In the center of the site stood an old, crumbling building half fallen into the earth. The walls were marked with faded Incan symbols, just like the ones they had found before. "This is it," Anna said, stepping out of the truck. She adjusted the strap of her backpack. "We need to check the seismic readings first. We're looking for anything that might tell us what's beneath." The team split into groups, setting up equipment and scanning the area. Garrett felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the symbols or the stories, something was beneath the earth. He could feel it. They made their way to the mine shaft, a massive gaping hole that had long since been abandoned. The air around it was thick, unnaturally still. The temperature had dropped significantly since they'd arrived, the wind biting at their faces as they approached. Anna checked the seismic readings again. Her face went pale. "There's something there. A massive disturbance deep underground. The readings are off the charts. It's not natural." Garrett's heart skipped a beat. He'd known it. They were already here. The team gathered around the opening, staring into the darkness below. There was something unsettling about the air here. The cold, the whispers, the feeling that they were being watched. It pressed in on them from all sides, and Garrett could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Suddenly, one of the technicians cried out, "I found something." Everyone rushed to his side. He was kneeling beside a pile of rubble, digging frantically through the dirt. Garrett leaned over, his breath catching in his throat. There, buried beneath layers of earth and stone, was another door. The same design. The same symbols. The same cold. "We're too late," Garrett whispered. "It's opening." Anna stared at the door. What did we unleash? Before Garrett could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The air grew colder, more oppressive. The door began to move. And in that moment, Garrett knew they had made a grave mistake. The whispers began. They weren't coming from the door. They were coming from inside. The air was thick with dread, the cold so biting it gnawed at the very core of Garrett's being. As he and his team made their way further into the mines, the whispers began to grow louder. They weren't just coming from the door anymore. No, now they seemed to come from everywhere. From the rock, from the walls, from the very ground beneath their feet. As if the earth itself was alive, aware of their presence, and desperately trying to communicate something. "This place, it feels like it's breathing," Anna whispered as she walked beside him, her voice trembling despite her calm exterior. She kept adjusting her gloves as though the icy air was seeping into her skin too. She had no idea how right she was. The team moved cautiously, the sound of their boots crunching on the cold, uneven floor the only thing that broke the oppressive silence. The further they descended into the mine, the more surreal the experience became. The once familiar walls of rock now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The symbols carved into the stone were everywhere, twisting and spiraling into patterns that defied explanation. They had been so simple at first, but now they seemed to shift, becoming more complex, more intricate with each step they took. They could feel the weight of something ancient and malevolent behind them, like the watchful eyes of something far older than mankind. Garrett didn't need to look back to know it was there. It was always there now. They had found the door, another one, hidden deep beneath the earth just as they had feared. The same symbols, the same structure. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the door they'd uncovered, it was what lay beyond it. The temperature had dropped another few degrees as they approached. The air was thick with frost. It stung Garrett's lungs when he breathed. But the cold didn't stop there. It felt like it was sinking deep into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger too, like blood and decay. It lingered, thick and cloying. Garrett reached into his backpack, pulling out his thermal camera. His hands shook as he aimed the lens toward the door. "Check this out," he said quietly to Anna. The image on the screen was terrifying. The door itself was surrounded by an unnatural cold zone, but it wasn't just a static cold. There was movement. A cold vortex, like a swirling current of ice, was pulling inward, bending the air around the door like a whirlpool, as if something was reaching for them. "God," Anna breathed. "What is that?" "It's pulling energy from everything." Garrett swallowed hard, staring at the door. He wanted to turn away to run, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had learned, everything they had discovered. They had opened this door. They had let it in. "We're too late," Garrett muttered. "They're coming through." As if on cue, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The low rumble reverberated through the mine, followed by a sharp, sickening crack, a sound like bones snapping. "Everyone get back," Garrett shouted. "Now." But it was too late. The vibrations intensified. The walls of the mine shifted, the tunnels warping and cracking as though the earth itself was giving way. The door groaned, its ancient stone creaking under some unseen pressure, as though it was being pushed open from the other side. Garrett grabbed Anna's arm, pulling her away from the door, but it was like moving through molasses. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thickening around them. And then it happened. The door exploded inward. The sound was deafening. A rush of freezing air hit them, knocking them to the ground. The world tilted as if the very laws of physics were being rewritten. For a split second, Garrett thought he might pass out. His vision blurred, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. When the world snapped back into focus, all he could see was darkness. And then the whispers returned. Not just from the door. They were coming from the walls, the rocks, the floor. "They're here." The voice was not human. It was a screeching rasp, as though the sound itself was being ripped apart by something otherworldly. Something ancient and hungry. Garrett forced himself to his feet, his body shaking violently. He could feel the cold pressing in, suffocating him. It was as if the temperature had dropped so drastically that the air itself had frozen solid, and yet he was still breathing. The cold didn't make sense. It shouldn't be possible. He glanced at Anna, who was standing, her eyes wide in terror. Her breath came out in quick, shallow gasps, her face pale with fear. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What is that?" Before Garrett could answer, the air around them began to shimmer. A strange, rippling distortion in space appeared before him. It was like staring into the surface of water. Everything was bending, warping in unnatural ways. He felt his head swim as he tried to make sense of it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. His vision faltered. And then, out of the darkness, they appeared. The first figure stepped through the distortion. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body encased in shadows, only the faintest outline visible against the swirling void behind it. It seemed to glide more than walk, its movements smooth and unnerving. Garrett's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for his gun. His fingers were slick with sweat, his whole body trembling. The figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its form shifting, becoming clearer. It had a face, sort of. It was featureless at first, just a shadow. But as it moved closer, Garrett saw something, or rather nothing. A face like a blank canvas, a featureless void. The more he stared at it, the more the void seemed to consume him. He couldn't look away. The figure's hand, long and thin, stretched out towards them. It was not a human hand, not by any means. It was an appendage, an elongated appendage with too many fingers, each one tapering into jagged claws that scraped against the floor like ice. Garrett's breath hitched in his throat. "Anna," he whispered, but his voice was barely audible. "Run." But Anna didn't move. She was staring at the figure, her eyes wide with awe and terror. "What is it?" she whispered. "What does it want?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. There was a sudden crack and the stone wall beside them shattered. Something was coming through, tearing at the fabric of the mine, ripping its way into their world. The whispering, maddening voices swirled louder in their ears, filling the space until Garrett thought his skull would explode. Anna screamed. The figure lunged. But Garrett didn't have time to react. The whole world seemed to collapse into a kaleidoscope of impossible angles, and everything went black. Garrett awoke on the cold stone floor. His limbs were stiff, his body aching as though he'd been crushed. His helmet was gone, his equipment scattered. Panic flooded him as he tried to sit up, but his head swam. Where was Anna? "Anna?" he called, his voice hoarse. The mine was eerily silent. The whispers had stopped. It was as if everything had disappeared. Then a low growl filled the air. It wasn't an animal. It was something worse, something primal, ancient. Garrett looked up to see her. Anna. But she wasn't right. Her body was contorted, bent in unnatural angles. Her eyes, those eyes, were hollow, devoid of light. Her skin was stretched too tight across her bones, and her mouth hung open, twisted into an expression that wasn't hers. "Anna?" Garrett whispered, his heart seizing in his chest. The whispering returned. Louder, closer. Anna's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and a voice, not hers, spoke. "You opened the door." And then it spoke again. "Now, you'll let us in." The air in the cavern grew heavy. It was no longer just cold, it was suffocating. The atmosphere around Garrett felt thick, like something was pressing against his chest, pushing him deeper into the earth, urging him towards something beyond the veil of human comprehension. The whispers, once distant, were now omnipresent, a chorus that filled his ears, scratching at the inside of his skull. It was a constant hum that began as a low murmur and then escalated into a maddening roar. They weren't just whispers now, they were demands, their voices clawing through his thoughts, trying to rip through the boundaries of his sanity. "Garrett?" The voice broke through the cacophony. It was Anna's voice, or what used to be Anna's voice. It was wrong. Twisted. A hollow echo. He stood frozen in place, staring at the twisted shape that had once been his colleague. Anna's form was bent unnaturally, her body stretched and distorted in ways that defied anatomy. Her eyes, black and soulless, stared back at him, hollow pits of darkness. Her skin was translucent, with veins that seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow beneath her surface. "You're too late," Anna's voice rasped, her lips curling into a sickening, toothless grin. "They've come, and they're awake." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, each syllable wrapping around his insides, squeezing tight until he thought he might implode. The doors, the ancient, cryptic structures that had torn apart the fabric of reality itself, weren't merely passages to another world. They were something far more insidious. They were connections. Gateways not just to different places but to something far older, something far darker, something that had been waiting for humanity to open the door. But it wasn't just Anna. It was everyone in the team. The whispers, the cold, the strange symbols, they were all connected to the doors, each one a signal, a siren call from a world beyond comprehension. The doors weren't just gateways, they were conduits for something else. And that something was coming through. As Garrett stumbled back, his hand brushing against the cold stone of the mine's wall, a horrible realization began to creep into his mind. These doors weren't just ancient relics, they were alive. The symbols carved into the stone were more than just markings. They were a language. A language designed not to communicate but to connect. These weren't just doors, they were anchors. Anchors to other dimensions. To worlds not bound by the rules of physics. To realms where time and space bent in ways that were incomprehensible to human minds. "Garrett!" Dr. Gomez's voice called out, cutting through the insanity that was beginning to overtake him. "We have to get out of here. Now." But Garrett couldn't move. His body was paralyzed. His feet wouldn't obey him, as if the very ground beneath him had a grip on his soul, pulling him deeper into the shadows. The cavern around him was no longer just rock and stone. It was breathing. The walls seemed to pulse with life. The ceiling above him, once a distant expanse, now seemed impossibly close, as though the very mountain was closing in on him. The air thickened, becoming suffocating. Every breath felt like 1,000 needles pricking his skin, every inhalation a struggle against the unseen force that was slowly tightening its grip around his chest. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice of Anna came again, but now it wasn't just her. It was all of them. Her voice blended with the others, Liam's, even the voices of the missing miners. Their voices echoed in unison, becoming a terrifying chorus that rattled his bones. "The door has been opened. You belong to us now." And then, with a sickening lurch, the ground beneath Garrett trembled. The walls around him shifted as if they were alive, breathing. And in the darkness, the air began to shimmer. The symbols carved into the stone flared to life, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Garrett's heart raced. No, 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 he thought frantically. He had to get out. He had to warn them. The doors, he realized, are not meant to be opened. What had started as an investigation into an archaeological oddity had turned into something far more dangerous. He wasn't just investigating ancient doors, he was dealing with forces. Forces that had waited, hidden in the darkness, for centuries. Forces that fed on humanity's curiosity, its desire for discovery. The doors had been waiting for them to open them, for them to step inside. Garrett spun around, finally managing to break free from the paralysis that gripped him. His legs felt weak and his movements were sluggish, like he was moving through molasses. He stumbled back toward Dr. Gomez, but as he did, a low rumbling sound filled the cavern. The ground trembled beneath his feet again, more violently this time. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a landslide. It was something else. Something worse. "They're coming," the voice whispered again. The floor cracked and the air chilled to an even more unnatural degree. Garrett turned to see what was happening. The stone in front of him began to crack, deep fissures splitting the floor open. Dark, oily tendrils slithered from the cracks, their writhing forms seeming to pulse with life. The same dark figures, the ones that had come through the first door, began to emerge from the cracks in the stone, their shapes twisting and contorting like liquid shadows. A sickening, guttural noise rumbled from deep within the mine. It sounded like something massive was stirring, something that had been slumbering for millennia. The shadows grew larger, their limbs stretching, elongating beyond any logical or natural form. Eyes, too many eyes, opened in their forms, their glowing orbs staring at Garrett with an intensity that froze him to his core. "Go! Go!" Dr. Gomez screamed, snapping Garrett out of his frozen stupor. Garrett barely had time to react before a shadow rushed at him, moving faster than anything should. He instinctively raised his hand in front of him as the figure lunged. The air around it seemed to distort and it pushed through the air like a living shadow too fast for him to follow. He felt its cold, clammy presence hit his chest as it knocked him to the ground. It was like being struck by an avalanche of icy water. His chest tightened, his breathing labored. But the creature didn't stop. It kept coming, its body undulating as if the fabric of space was bending to its will. Garrett's head spun. He couldn't focus. The cold overwhelmed him. The whispers, too loud now, filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. And then, something within him snapped. No, not again. Not this time. He reached deep inside, pulling every ounce of willpower he could muster, and screamed. The sound was deafening. It wasn't just a cry. It was a sound that echoed through the very core of the cavern, shaking the walls, reverberating into the darkness beyond. As he screamed, the shadows recoiled, as though his voice had reached into their very existence and torn at the fabric of their being. The creature halted, its form flickering in and out of visibility like a malfunctioning hologram. It hissed in a language that felt wrong, its voice an unearthly screech that made Garrett's teeth grind. And then, with an abruptness that made Garrett's head spin, the creature vanished into the air, leaving behind a lingering sense of death and decay. Garrett collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Dr. Gomez rushed to his side, her face pale, eyes wide with horror. "We have to leave," Dr. Gomez whispered. "Now." But Garrett didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing. His body felt like it had been drained of everything, energy, willpower, strength. But the worst part was the cold. It was inside of him now. It had sunk so deep into his bones that he was sure it would never leave. The whispers had found him and they weren't going anywhere. They were following him. Something had been unleashed. And it was only the beginning. Garrett slowly stood up, his head pounding, his body aching. His eyes shifted toward the door. The door that had opened the gateway to everything. To this nightmare. It was still there. Waiting. But now it wasn't just the door they had to worry about. Now it was everything that had slipped through with it. And there was no going back. The whispering grew louder as Garrett and Dr. Gomez turned and fled down the narrow tunnel. Each step felt like it brought them deeper into a trap they couldn't escape. Something was coming. The cavern was alive. It throbbed. The walls pulsed with a rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat, beating in time with the whispers that had begun to overtake Garrett's mind. The air was thick, choking, as if the world itself was breathing in time with something far older than human comprehension, something ancient and malevolent. And behind him, the door had swung open fully now, and the horrors that spilled through it had turned the very essence of the mine into something darker, something no longer just human. Garrett had seen things, during the time they'd spent researching the doors. The terrifying, shifting forms that emerged from the cracks, the blackened eyes that burned through space, the distorted shapes that should have never existed. He had seen them before, and yet, standing at the threshold of that cavernous rift, the terror was magnified tenfold. It wasn't just what was behind the door anymore. It was what was here now. They were here. And they were coming. "We have to close it," Garrett said, his voice trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he'd been avoiding since the first moment he'd laid eyes on the stone door in Colorado. But Dr. Gomez didn't answer. She was too busy scanning the area, her face pale, a mix of terror and disbelief on her features as she observed the unnatural phenomena unfolding before them. The stone in the cavern was cracking, long fissures spreading out like veins, the walls visibly twitching. Something was moving in the rock, something alive. The temperature was dropping further. The cold had crept past unbearable and into the realm of unnatural. It was seeping into their bones now, freezing them from the inside out. Garrett swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel it, the air had become thick with something more than cold. The whispers, those damnable whispers, were louder now, their voices not just echoing through his skull but piercing it. They were not just sound. They were thoughts, old thoughts, alien thoughts. The kind of thoughts that made him question his very humanity, his reality. "Griffin," Dr. Gomez said quietly, her voice trembling. "Do you hear them?" "I hear them," Garrett replied, his voice low, strained. "But we can't listen to them. We need to close it. Now." The first step was simple, the door. The massive stone door with its strange symbols and its unnatural cold, the door that had been calling to them, was wide open. The passage beyond, now visible, looked like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't a cave or a tunnel. It wasn't anything that could fit into the framework of the physical world. It stretched far beyond the limits of human perception, a world that twisted in impossible geometries and unnatural architectures. It was a place that defied physics, where time bled and splintered and gravity no longer made sense. But worse than that was what Garrett felt coming through. It wasn't just air. It wasn't just the cold. It was presence. A presence so overwhelming, it felt like the very fabric of the world was beginning to tear. He could feel it closing in on him, a weight pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe, to think. Whatever was beyond that door, the creatures, the horrors, whatever they were more than just beings from another world. They were the manifestation of something darker, older. They were born from nothingness, the space between realities, and now they were breaking through. "We can't fight them," Dr. Gomez said, her voice breaking. "We can't fight whatever is behind that door. We can't even comprehend it." "We don't need to fight them," Garrett said grimly. "We need to close the damn door." It was that simple, and that impossible. The descent into the depths had been too easy. The earlier path had felt like a journey into hell itself, but now they had reached a point of no return. The walls, once smooth and rock-solid, were now slick with something that wasn't just moisture. It was slime, a black, oozing substance that seemed to pulse with an eerie light, as though it had a life of its own. Something behind it was alive. The ground, too, was no longer just rock and dirt. As Garrett's boots sank into the floor, it felt like stepping into something gelatinous, like the ground was giving way beneath him, like it had begun to breathe. He glanced up, seeing that the ceiling was no longer just rock either. It was shifting. It had become something organic. And through the shifting surfaces, he could see the faint outlines of eyes that blinked, that moved as if they were watching. And yet, no matter the terror, Garrett was compelled to move forward. His footsteps faltered, but he didn't stop. The door, the heart of it all, was still open. And now, as the whispers turned into frenzied screams, as the temperature plummeted to a level that threatened to freeze his very soul, Garrett knew what he had to do. "We need to destroy it," he muttered to himself. He gripped the small device in his hand, an explosive charge. The same kind of charge he'd used in his years as an expert in structural engineering. It wasn't enough to just close the door. He needed to make sure it couldn't ever be opened again. If the world was to survive, he needed to seal the damn thing forever. He reached out, carefully placing the explosive charge against the door's stone surface. He could feel it tremble beneath his fingers, the vibrations thrumming in his bones. The door was waking up. It was alive. And then came the sound, a low, guttural roar, one that seemed to originate from the very bowels of the earth. It shook the cavern to its core, sending dust and rocks tumbling from the ceiling. The temperature dropped even further, until it felt like the world was freezing in on itself. The cold, that unnatural cold, gripped Garrett's heart. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't fight it. But he could seal it. "Hurry," Dr. Gomez urged. "Hurry, Garrett, before they get through." Garrett turned to face the door, gripping the detonator. The final moments were a blur, time bent, twisted, as if the world was fighting against him. But he didn't hesitate. He slammed his finger down on the detonator. A roar louder than anything Garrett had ever heard shattered the silence, an explosion of sound and light that split the cavern in two. The door trembled and cracked, its surface splintering as the explosive force rippled through it. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. Then the door shattered. In that split second, a force unlike anything Garrett could imagine ripped through the cavern. It was like being caught in the epicenter of an earthquake, a hurricane, and a wildfire all at once. The world tilted, the walls cracked, the air snapped with the force of something that shouldn't exist. A pressure so intense pressed down on Garrett that he thought he might implode. The screams of the creatures, they were the things behind the door, ripped through the air, louder and more terrifying than any nightmare could ever be. They were no longer just whispers. They were screeches, shrieks that pierced the very fabric of the universe. As the door collapsed, the very cavern began to buckle. The walls cracked and groaned as the ground split wide open. Garrett could hear the rushing of wind, of something far more malevolent and ancient than the world could comprehend, flooding through the rift. And then, the light from the world beyond the door surged outward, as if reaching for him. "Griffin." Dr. Gomez's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to get out now." But it was too late. As Garrett turned to run, the very ground beneath him cracked open, and the darkness beyond the door began to pour into the world he knew. The creatures, the things, began to emerge from the broken stone, a flood of twisted shapes and writhing limbs. And they weren't just watching anymore. They were coming. They were everywhere. And this time there would be no closing the door. The world had shifted. It was no longer the world Garrett had once known. The world of cold air, darkened tunnels, and ancient mysteries had collapsed into something else entirely, something unrecognizable, something monstrous. The moment the last stone of the door shattered, everything changed. Garrett could feel the pull of the other side, like the earth itself was being torn apart by the forces unleashed. He had seen horrors beyond comprehension in the caverns beneath Machu Picchu, but this was a horror of another magnitude entirely. It was not just the creatures that had emerged, not just the whispers or the shadows, but the reality itself that was beginning to buckle. The door was more than a passage. It was the threshold between this world and something far darker, something that had been waiting for a long time. And now it was free. Garrett's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled through the crumbling cavern, his breath ragged in the bitter cold. The ceiling above him groaned, the world shaking like an earthquake had torn open the very bones of the planet. Every step he took was a battle against the weight of something ancient, something that was trying to consume him, to pull him into the abyss. "Griffin, move." Dr. Gomez's voice sliced through the chaos, frantic. "Now." Garrett didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted through the collapsing passage, hearing the sound of distant, tortured shrieks echoing behind him. Something was following them. The walls of the cavern were cracking, splintering into jagged edges, and above them, the dark sky, the sky that was supposed to be a solid mass of stars, had warped into a fractured web of light, as though reality itself was beginning to unravel. They were here. The things beyond the door, the horrors that had been waiting for centuries, for millennia, had found their way into this world. And now the gates were wide open. Garrett glanced over his shoulder, his heart skipping a beat as a monstrous shape emerged from the fissures in the rock. It was long and twisting, like an aberration of nature, with limbs too long, too many eyes that burned like dying suns. They were coming. "We need to close it," Dr. Gomez shouted, but Garrett barely heard her. There was no time. Not anymore. The door had been shattered, the walls broken, and now they had to stop the invasion, stop it before it was too late. They scrambled out of the tunnels, their feet slipping on the unstable ground, hands grasping at the jagged rock walls. The mine had become a war zone, something beyond chaos. The air was thick with an unnatural chill that burned their lungs with each breath. The tremors beneath their feet were relentless, shaking the very foundation of the world as it began to crack wide open. The sunlight, once a sign of hope, now seemed distant, alien. It couldn't penetrate the strange, fractured sky above. The shadows of impossible things reached across the land, stretching and writhing like serpents, eager to devour everything in their path. The team reached the surface, but it was too late. The sky had darkened, swirling with an unnatural storm. The ground was no longer solid beneath their feet. It was bending, shifting like it was alive. The very earth was being reshaped, and the sky was no longer just blue. It was alive, teeming with shapes that could never belong in a natural world. "What are they?" one of the security team members asked, his voice trembling, barely audible over the cacophony of cracks and groans that came from the land around them. Garrett didn't answer. There were no words left. No way to explain the unexplainable. The team had to act now. But the true horror had only just begun. They moved quickly, splitting into groups as they reached the outskirts of the mining complex. The machines were useless. Radios crackled and shorted. The very air seemed to distort any signal they tried to send. Dr. Gomez had gathered everyone together, her expression grim, her eyes hardened with the weight of their situation. "We need to seal the mine," she said, her voice calm but deadly serious. "If we can't close the doors, we need to prevent more from opening. And we can't do it alone." "We can't stop this," Garrett said, his voice hoarse. He was shaking, but not from fear. He could feel it, feel the shift, the pull of something larger than any of them. "We can," she said firmly. "We have to. The door's been breached. But if we can't stop what's coming through..." Garrett cut her off. "Then we'll need more than just a seal. We need to get out of here. We can't let them take the rest of the world," she argued. "I'm not talking about just us. I'm talking about the world. We can't fight them. Not like this. They'll break through every door until there's nothing left. We need a plan. We need something to stop them." Dr. Gomez looked him dead in the eyes, a mixture of disbelief and something darker, a recognition perhaps, crossing her face. "I don't think there's anything we can do." Garrett's gaze swept across the team. Everyone was scared, terrified. This was more than just survival. This was humanity's last stand. "We don't stop them," he said slowly, his voice low, almost reverent. "They'll consume us all." The ground began to shake again. Garrett felt his body stiffen. His breath quickened as the sound of cracking earth echoed through the air. He looked up, his eyes widening in horror as dark figures began to emerge from the cracks in the earth itself. These weren't just creatures. They were manifestations born from the void beyond the door. Their limbs stretched unnaturally, twisting and coiling as they crept closer. They weren't just beings, they were the physical embodiment of a nightmare made real. "I told you," Garrett whispered to himself. Dr. Gomez was shaking her head, eyes wide. "We have to stop this now." But Garrett knew. There was no stopping it. As the team fought to secure the area, it became clear, the doors weren't just breaking through. They were everywhere. From the mountains to the oceans, the fabric of the world itself had begun to tear. The creatures, things, were emerging at every known point of ancient power. The first door was just the beginning. Every corner of the earth was now a gateway, a rift through which they could pass. And humanity? Humanity was trapped. Trapped between a reality they knew, and an invasion they couldn't escape. The final blow came not from any weapon but from the doors themselves. The sky split wide open. In the days that followed, the world descended into madness. The rifts grew larger. More creatures poured through. And Garrett, along with the remnants of his team, moved to the mountains, driven by the only remaining hope they had. The plan? To close the doors one by one. To contain the outbreak before humanity was wiped from existence. But the doors, they were alive. And as long as they existed, so would the creatures from beyond. The earth would be their realm. And Garrett knew. It was only a matter of time before the doors stopped